Do you ever find yourself searching for something bigger than you? For a community to be a part of? A place founded on truth and love. A place to worship the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and the Son of God. Welcome to Founded in Truth, where we're more than just a fellowship. We're a family, so welcome home.
Title of my message today is Why Does God Allow Suffering? Now, no doubt about it, I believe that the biggest obstacle to our faith for both the believer and the unbeliever alike is this issue of suffering. It's the biggest obstacle. I talk to unbelievers a lot and even believers, and they agree that if you're an unbeliever, that this keeps you from really even believing in God. And if you're a believer, when you experience a tragedy, it's something that would affect you so deeply emotionally that you struggle with the idea of whether God exists, whether he's all good, whether he truly cares. And this is a question that's as old as time, and it affects all of us. It's not just some academic or theoretical question that we debate philosophically. No, it's something that's deeply personal. We've all experienced suffering to some degree. So this is an important question. Why does God allow suffering? And I'm going to try to give an answer to this question, some answers that I believe that emerge from Scripture as we study it in regards to this topic. But I want to be upfront with you guys and say that my message today is not going to do this topic any justice. I hope that it'll be edifying and encouraging, but there are lots of other resources on this topic. So if you leave today and you're not satisfied by the message that I gave, I want to assure you that it's all my fault. That it's not the Bible's fault, it's not Christianity's fault, that there are good answers to these questions if you're willing to investigate them honestly. But still, I'm going to try my best today. So what do we mean when we talk about suffering? Well, there are many different types of suffering in this world. The one that comes to mind for a lot of us, I believe, is the suffering of loss. There is perhaps no experience more painful in life than losing a loved one to death, in my opinion. At my church back home in St. Louis, there was a family there that lost their son, who was a young boy, 12 years old, and he got sick, and he died. And I remember our church was praying for him, and the moment we got the news that he had passed away, I have a distinct memory of my wife and I in our kitchen just hugging each other and weeping and asking why. It just doesn't make any sense. It just seems so senseless that this innocent young boy would be taken. And we were utterly devastated. The loss was just felt so deeply in our community, and especially within the family. There's also the suffering that we experience of sickness and disease, and the agony that people have to live with. I have friends who actually live with chronic pain. They're stuck with it. They don't have a choice. They just have to live with the chronic pain in their bodies. And you have to wonder, what's the point of that? Why do they have to live that way? Why do they have to live in pain? Why doesn't God heal them? These are questions that we have. There's also the suffering that we see in the world of injustice, oppression. And we often have to wonder when we look on the news, when we look out our window, how can God allow the evil that exists in this world? How can God be all good and all loving and allow the Holocaust? To allow sex trafficking, to allow racism and bigotry to continue. And while, a lot of people, they look at hatred and they say, oh, there's just so much hatred in this world, and it's so awful. And I agree that there is a lot of hatred in this world, but I believe that there's an injustice and an oppression and a sinful attitude that's even worse than hatred, and that is indifference. That there's an evil indifference, a complete disregard for life in this world. How many of you ever seen Schindler's List? There's this really powerful scene in that movie where the Nazi, he wakes up and, he's drinking some liquor and smoking, and he just takes his gun and he's stretching and yawning, and he's sitting up on his balcony and he's just shooting people and killing them for fun. Evil for the sake of evil. He doesn't hate any of those people. At least with hatred, you have some shred of humanity inside of you. But it was a complete indifference to their life. We see that, and that's the Holocaust, but this indifference exists even today. I read a story recently of these teenagers, because they were bored, they found a disabled man and they tortured him and filmed it on Facebook Live. And when they filmed it, you can hear them in the background of this video just laughing about it. Evil purely for the sake of doing evil. They didn't hate the disabled man. They were just indifferent to his life. If they didn't find a disabled man, they'd probably find an animal to torture or something. And this exists, and you have to wonder, why? Why doesn't God put a stop to this? There's another kind of suffering that we don't often talk about, and that is inward suffering. Inward depression, a deep, continuous, dull ache in our heart. A quiet, crushing despair that many people live with. Many people are falling apart on the inside, and nobody even knows it. And the people that struggle with this deep emotional anguish, they're afraid to even open up to anyone else out of fear that it'll only make matters worse. They'll be rejected. They have a insecurity, a shame, and a guilt for how they feel. The suffering in this world often keeps me up at night. Everything from the news that I see outside in the world to the very evil and hatred that exists even in my own heart, and the suffering that I've caused others through my selfishness, through my own evil, through my own indifference. So people often ask the question, how can an all-good, all-loving God allow the suffering in our world? And I want to assure you guys today that the Bible is not silent on this issue. The Bible actually has a lot to say about this issue. There's entire books of the Bible solely devoted to this issue. The book of Job, for instance, in the New Testament talks a lot about enduring suffering and what you're to do in the midst of suffering. So here's some of the questions that we're going to answer today in this message, or attempt to answer. The first question is, does the reality of suffering disprove God's existence? A lot of people believe that it does. The second question that we'll address is, why do bad things happen to good people? That age-old question. The third question is, what is God's solution to the problem of suffering? And the fourth question is, how are we, as disciples of Yeshua, Jesus, how are we supposed to respond to the suffering in the world? Here's a common objection that you'll often hear from an atheist or a skeptic. They'll say, there cannot be a God because there is too much evil and suffering in this world. I've talked to a lot of atheists, and this is their objection. When it comes down to it, when you press them long enough on what really is the issue, what really is the obstacle, most of the time it comes down to this issue. And from an emotional standpoint, I have to admit that this is a powerful objection, emotionally. This point of view might make sense to a lot of us. I've struggled with this question. But when we actually examine this argument logically, it breaks down. When we take a closer look, this is more of just an emotional objection and not a rational one. Now, we will deal with the emotional objection because this is a powerful emotional objection, as we know. But right now, I want to focus on the logic of this statement right here. And in fact, it's ironic. The reality of evil in our world actually proves God's existence. What do I mean by that? Well, the existence of evil entails the existence of good. You can't have evil without good. The existence of good and evil entails the existence of a transcendent moral law by which good and evil can be identified. If there is no transcendent moral law on the basis of differentiating or judging something to be good or evil, then good and evil is completely relative and completely meaningless. There is no good or evil. Thirdly, the existence of a transcendent moral law entails the existence of a transcendent moral lawgiver, also known as God. So the very argument breaks down because you have to assume the existence of God to even be able to make the objection against God on the basis of the existence of evil. You can't have evil without good. You can't have good without an objective moral law, and you cannot have a moral law without God. So an atheist can't even judge religion or criticize religion as being evil, as what often happens, without assuming that God exists to be able to even criticize it. Think about it. How can we judge evil to be evil without a standard? It simply can't exist. It's relative. It's meaningless. The most that we can say is we don't like it. I don't like evil. Nobody likes evil. But we can't call it evil in any meaningful way. Thus, without God, this very question of suffering is meaningless. It's just nature doing what nature does, survival of the fittest. We're born, we suffer, we die, end of story, that's it. Goodbye. But we all know that isn't true, right? Deep down, we all have, even the atheist, deep down, we all have this deep sense of purpose and justice. When someone steals from someone else, they say, the person that was stolen from will say, that's wrong. Every time. They're going to say, that's an injustice. That's wrong. You can't just steal from somebody. So, by doing that, they're affirming their belief in objective morals, even though they don't even believe in them. They don't even believe in the very source from which those objective morals come. Where do they come from? Where does this deep sense of purpose and morality come from? Did we just evolve to have these moral sensibilities? Did we just evolve to have a sense of justice? Nature doesn't care about justice. Nature doesn't care about morality. It's concerned only with survival. When a lion kills an animal, the lion didn't murder the animal. The lion was just being a lion. But as humans, we're separate from the animals. As humans, it is different. When a human murders a human, when there is sex trafficking, when there is murder, when people are taken advantage of, when people are oppressed, it is not just nature. They are moral evils. They are moral abominations. And I would submit to you that it's because we are created in the very image of God, that we were endowed with that deep sense of purpose, justice, and morality metaphysically from the only source from which those things can come, which is that transcendent moral lawgiver. So here's my argument. God must exist. The only way that the issue of evil and suffering can have any meaning is if we assume an objective standard of good and evil. And the only way that standard can truly exist is if God exists. The only way that standard can truly exist is if God exists. So here's another question to get a little bit more nuanced here, all right? So if we assume evil, we assume that there must be a moral law. If we assume that moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver on the basis of which evil and good can be judged. So God must exist if there is evil and suffering in the world. But here's another question. How can God be all good and allow all the suffering in the world? Because we believe that as Christians, right? We believe that God is all good and all powerful. If he's all good and he has the power to stop something, he has the power to heal someone of a sickness, of a disease, he has the power to raise someone from the dead, he has the power to put an end to justice and oppression, to step in, to divinely intervene. What are the answers to these questions? Well, here's some answers that I would like to propose to you. The first answer is human free will. Human free will. God has given mankind free will. Mankind often chooses to go against God's will. The fact that mankind chooses evil does not prove that God isn't good. The fact that mankind chooses evil does not prove that God isn't good. So here's the issue. We must come to grips with the fact that much of the human suffering in this world, not all of it, but much of the human suffering in this world is the result of human evil. It's the result of our own choices. So why do we blame God for the messes that we often create ourselves? If a father tells his son, do not touch the stove, it's hot, and the son disobeys the father and he touches the stove and he burns himself and he experiences suffering to that degree, was it the father's fault for having a stove in the house? Was it the stove's fault for being hot? No, it was the boy's fault for disobeying the father's commandment. We know this. In Deuteronomy 30:19, God gives us the choice. He says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live. We have the choice. And much of the suffering that we endure in this life is the consequence of our own choices. Now, many times we suffer not because of our own choices. Many times there are innocent people that suffer because of the choices of others. Other people make choices that affect other people. In fact, the very reason we are all in this mess to begin with, the very reason we are even having this discussion of why God would allow suffering is because of the choice of two people. Adam and Eve. The scripture says, the Apostle Paul says that sin entered the world through one man, through Adam. This is the world that we've inherited. This is the biblical doctrine known as the fall, right? We inherit the world that we've been given, and that world has been corrupted through that act of rebellion in the beginning. And a lot of people ask, by the way, how could they make that choice? They were living in paradise. They were living in paradise. They were living in harmony with God. What on earth would compel them to disobey God, to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? But we make that exact same choice all the time, don't we? A good example would be we as humans, we make that choice. A good example would be adultery, right? You have a marriage or a man who has a good marriage, a good life, kids, that loving environment, that paradise, if you will. And because of a fleeting moment of pleasure, he throws that all away. It's the exact same choice. But this begs the question, does God have good reasons for allowing evil and suffering to the extent that he does? Why do we have to suffer because of Adam and Eve? Why do we have to suffer because of the choices of others? And some things just seem senseless and random. And, as I said, God has the power to stop it, doesn't he? He has the power to intervene. Why doesn't he? If he loves us. So here's my second answer. Number one, God is all-knowing, and he sees the end from the beginning. As finite creatures, we have limited knowledge of the universe and God's plans. We, therefore, cannot judge God as having no good reason for allowing suffering. So, to put it another way, the burden of proof is on the one making this objection to show that evil and suffering is logically incompatible with an all-good God. And the way that we can show that evil and suffering is compatible with an all-good God is by asserting that it's at least possible that God has good reasons to allow the suffering in the world. So as long as it's possible that God has good reasons to allow the suffering in the world, this objection breaks down. Since none of us are all-knowing, none of us are omniscient, none of us can therefore say that it's logically impossible for God to have good reasons for allowing suffering. William Lane Craig, he's a Christian philosopher and theologian. He actually gives a great illustration from a developing field of science known as chaos theory. And basically within this chaos theory, it's been discovered that weather systems and insect populations are extremely sensitive to the smallest influences. The smallest influence from an outside force, they're extremely sensitive to that. So for example, a butterfly fluttering its wings on a branch may set in motion events leading to a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And they've been able to look at this and discover how these events are connected in this crazy way. But nobody watching a butterfly flutter its wings on a branch would predict, oh yeah, a hurricane's going to come from that. It's impossible to know. In the same way, the seemingly senseless death of a child from leukemia could result in a ripple effect through history that God's good reason, his morally sufficient reason for allowing that to happen, wouldn't even emerge until centuries later in another land, and none of us would even be able to see the connection. We just don't know. We don't know. However, as Christians, as believers in Yeshua, Jesus, we can have hope that there is a good reason. We can have faith because we know that God is all good. We have faith in an all good God. We know that he is just, that he is righteous, because many of us have seen this exact thing in our very own lives. Many of us have gone through tragedies. Many of us have endured suffering. And many times, we might never know the reason. But there are some times that we do see the reason. We do discover the purpose. And we do realize God's good reason for allowing that. A good example of this in Scripture would be Joseph, Jacob's son Joseph, right? God gave him all of these amazing dreams, all of these amazing visions. You're going to rule. I have a purpose for you. And then he was betrayed by his family, thrown into a well, sold into slavery, later put into prison, falsely accused. And you have to imagine what he was probably feeling like in prison when he was sitting there. I'm like, God, I thought you gave me all of these amazing visions. I thought you gave me this purpose. Why am I in prison? Why would you allow this to happen? Yet, little did he know that was the position he needed to be in order for God to take him to the place where he could be used for God's glory, for the salvation of Israel, right? So another question that we're going to talk about today is, what is God's solution to the problem of evil? Because while I think all of this stuff that we just went over, while it is important to talk about, it's important to discuss why things happen. The Bible is more concerned with what we're to do in the midst of suffering. But before we get there, I have to address a false doctrine that many of you are probably familiar with, and that is the idea that the goal of human life is health, wealth, and prosperity. That the goal of our life, that we're God's little pets, and God's job is to make a nice, comfortable little environment for us to exist in. And if that's true, if the Bible really taught that false doctrine, it doesn't, but if it did, then I would agree with the atheist that suffering is indeed useless, because it's counterproductive to the life that God made for us, right? We're supposed to be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous, and we're not. But that's not what the Bible teaches. God's job is to not make sure that we are happy in this life. The goal of this life is knowing God and bringing glory to his name. And sometimes that happens through suffering. In fact, many times it happens through suffering. If the point of this life was to achieve perfect happiness, suffering is useless. However, the point of this life is not to achieve perfect happiness. It's to achieve the knowledge of God and to bring him glory. To that end, suffering is not useless, but rather an opportunity to fulfill the purpose of this life. Again, you have Joseph in the Bible. You have many of the characters in the Bible that we see this with. We have our own personal experiences in which we've gone through something. We've gone through trials and tribulations, and we've grown spiritually as a result of those things. So the question should not be, God, why would you allow this to happen? The question we ought to ask ourselves is, how are we going to respond? How am I going to respond to this? Am I going to respond with anger towards God, shaking my fist and protesting that life's not fair? Or am I going to respond with a trust in him that he is all-knowing, that he is all good, that he has a reason, even though I am limited and I might never know the reason, that I can trust in him and have faith that there is a reason. So here's the Bible's first solution to the problem of suffering. The first solution is that suffering will end. Scripture teaches that Yeshua's kingdom will come in fullness when he returns. We look forward to the return of Yeshua when he will establish his kingdom on earth and bring a complete end to suffering forever. Revelation 21 says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. This takes place after Yeshua returns, after the millennial reign. The New Jerusalem is ushered in, and we're given this promise that one day suffering will end. One day there won't be any crying. One day there won't be any more mourning over loss. God promises to one day set things right. If you remove God from this equation, and therefore you remove the reality of God's coming kingdom in fullness, suffering is never made right. There is literally not any justice. Evil prevails, and good people suffer, and that's it. End of story, literally. That's it. There is no purpose in this life without God, without a resolution. Suffering is meaningless. You better hope you had a good life, because this is all you're going to have. I was talking to an atheist friend of mine, and he's very intellectually honest. And he actually admitted to me that the biggest problem that he has with his atheistic philosophy is this issue of meaninglessness. That ultimately, the logical conclusion of atheism is nihilism, basically, is that there is no purpose or meaning to anything. You just float along. Why even try to make a good world? Why even stand up against injustice? Why even get married? Why even live if there's no purpose? I mean, the sun's just going to burn out eventually down the road anyway, trillions of years in the future. Sun's going to burn out. The planet's just going to, be destroyed. Human life is going to be annihilated. And it literally, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of existence and time, literally, human life would have been inconsequential, meaningless. That's what atheism gives us. But with God, we have hope. With God and the reality of God's coming kingdom and the reality of true resolution, the reality of reconciliation and justice and truth prevailing, we have that hope. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18 says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul compares the suffering of this life to a light momentary affliction in light of eternity. It's a light momentary affliction. Listen, God's going to fix this. Eternity is real. God's kingdom is real. So the first solution is that suffering will end. The second solution to God's problem is redemption, or to the problem of suffering is redemption. God works everything out for good, whether in this life or the next. We often grow spiritually through suffering. We learn obedience and gain wisdom. So redemption. So the question you should ask yourself is, what am I going through right now? Think of the tragedy or the emotional anguish that you might be experiencing right now. Ask yourself, could God be using this for my good? Is there a redemptive side to this? What is God teaching me through this? If it wasn't for the suffering that many of us have had to endure, many of us would not be who we are today. I certainly wouldn't. If I had not gone through the tragedies that I've gone through in my life, if I had not gone through a lot of the pain that I've experienced many times, consequences to my own poor choices, but if I had not gone through that, I simply wouldn't be who I am today. There's a spiritual maturity that can only be achieved through suffering. And I would submit to you that the image of God that we are to be to this world, God's process for conforming us into that image to be effective for his kingdom and for his name and his righteousness, the most effective way that he accomplishes conforming us into that image is through suffering. Psalm 119:67 says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now that I have been afflicted, I keep your word." There's a redemption there. A redemption. He had to go through that affliction to get to that place where he would be able to keep God's word. James 1:2-5 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." We're all familiar with that verse, but there's a reason why I included verse 5 there about asking God for wisdom. And it will be given to you. It's because getting wisdom from God is directly connected to going through trials and tribulations and gaining that steadfastness and being patient and considering that joy. God gives you wisdom through that. James 5 says, "As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." So we're told to look to Job. We're told to look to Job as an example of patience and endurance through suffering. What do we see with Job? The adversary accused Job of being faithful to God only because of God's protection and blessing. He's telling God, he's like, Job's not going to serve you. The only reason he's righteous is because you bless him and protect him. He has a good life. Once that good life is taken away, he's not going to bless you anymore. Yet what do we see? We see that Job remained faithful to God. He did not curse God with his lips, it says, even when the blessings and the protection in his life was taken away. That's what we're to look to as an example of endurance and patience through suffering. Did you know that the adversary makes that same accusation against all of you? He makes that same accusation against all of you. You only serve God because you have a good life. You only serve God because you like the benefits that you get from him, from that relationship. You're not truly faithful, the adversary says. You don't truly love God. Are you faithful? Are you faithful to God even in the midst of suffering? Romans 5:3-4 says, "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings." We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. God is much more concerned about your character than he is about your comfort. He is much more concerned about you coming to know him in a deeper way, which, by the way, is the only true way to have fulfillment in this life. Read the book of Ecclesiastes. If you want to find fulfillment in this life through a nice, happy, easy existence, through pleasure and through all the material possessions, Solomon can tell you all about the worthlessness of that. You're not going to be able to carry that stuff with you to eternity. That stuff is meaningless. It's vanity, according to Scripture. The only way to have true fulfillment and purpose and identity in this life is through a relationship with God. Which brings me to the third solution. The third solution to God's problem, or to the problem of suffering. is God himself. God is the answer. God cares. He's involved. He responds. God understands your suffering. Why? Because he also suffered. And God gives our suffering meaning. It's not pointless. It's not senseless. He gives our suffering meaning. Psalm 8:4 says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" God cares for us. I'm just astounded by that. It's astonishing to me that God would care about me. He's the creator of the universe, this vast universe. And yet, he has concern and regard for my life and your life. Job was important enough to God that in his affliction, God drew near to him. God answered him. And yes, there was reproof and rebuke there from God to Job and his friends, but it's enough that God answered. It's enough that he cared to answer, that he didn't just let us wallow around in our misery, but that he responds to us. And more than that, he understands us. He understands what it's like to suffer. He understands loss as a father who gave his only son. Yeshua also understands the pain of loss. In John 11, this is when Yeshua, he was visiting the people who were mourning the death of Lazarus. And this is what it says: "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' They said to him, 'Lord, come see.' Jesus wept. So the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.'" Jesus wept. Such a simple statement. 2 verses, a simple statement, and yet it speaks volumes of the character and the tender love of our God. He was moved to tears. Why? Because he saw people mourning. He saw the pain and the anguish of the people that were suffering, that were crying, that were impacted by that loss of their friend, their family member. He knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Why didn't he just say, "Guys, don't know why you're so upset. I'm going to raise him from the dead. All we have to do is name it and claim it, and it's all good"? No. He met them in their suffering. He met them in their anguish, their mourning, and he wept with them. We are Yeshua's friends too, right? And when we weep, Yeshua weeps with us. When we are going through tremendous suffering, Yeshua is right there with us, crying with us, holding us. The Psalms say that God is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. God has a special place in his heart for hurting people. So if you are suffering today, this is your opportunity to worship and rejoice even in the midst of your suffering. And that is how God gives our suffering meaning. Because it's no longer just meaningless suffering. It's no longer than just an inconvenience to a life that's supposed to be happy. No. This is your opportunity to experience the love and the presence of God in a deep and profound way that you wouldn't be able to experience otherwise. He says to draw near to him, and he will draw near to you. These are some quotes from Corrie ten Boom. If you don't know who that is, she was instrumental, she and her family were instrumental in saving Jews from the Holocaust, and she lived through that incredibly dark period and that experience. She saw the utter depravity of man. She saw the suffering of man. And this is what she says. She says, "Now I know in my experience, because I've experienced this, because I've experienced the darkness, now I know in my experience that Jesus' light is stronger than the biggest darkness. There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. No matter how far in the depths of grief that you find yourself, God's love is deeper still. God's love can still meet you there." This is a quote from William Lane Craig. I love this quote. He says, "To know God, the source of infinite goodness and love, is an incomparable good, the fulfillment of human existence. The sufferings of this life cannot be compared to it. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter what he suffers, no matter how awful his pain, can still say, 'God is good to me,' simply by virtue of the fact that he knows God, an incomparable good." As I mentioned before, the goal of this life is not health, wealth, and prosperity. That's not what's going to make us happy. Even if we obtain those things, that's not going to bring us lasting fulfillment. True human fulfillment in this life, true purpose in this life is found only through a relationship with Yeshua. As cliche as that sounds, it's the truth. The true source of human fulfillment, the true source of goodness, is through God, through knowing God and making him known. And that's the relationship that's going to carry over to the New Jerusalem, where suffering will be abolished. So here's the final question. How are disciples of Yeshua, Jesus, how are we supposed to respond to the suffering in this world? Well, here's some answers to that question. The first answer is stop causing it. Really, stop causing it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Stop oppressing people. Stop taking advantage of people. Stop being selfish. Walk as a child of God. Lay your life down for your friends, for your enemies. You're not going to help resolve this issue of suffering by contributing to it. The second answer is that we are to visit and care for the sick, the poor, and the oppressed. We are to stand up against injustice. We are to care for the sick. It actually says in Matthew 25, it says to visit the sick. Not just to lay your hands on them and pray for them to be healed, and I'm not taking away from that. We should do that too. That's my next point, or a couple points from now. But it says to visit them in their sickness, to be with them in their suffering. That entails a relationship. That entails an investment in people's lives. That entails a care and a love for people. Do you have that? Are you doing that? Do you have people in your lives? I want you to think of someone in your life right now that needs that human comfort. And you need to do something about it. Not just pray for them as well, but do something about that. It could be as easy as sending them an encouraging text message. We need to be thinking about these things. This is our mission. This is what we are called to as believers. Romans 12:15 says that we are to weep with those who weep, those who are going through loss, those who are suffering that grief, that inward anguish. That when one part of the body weeps, we also ought to weep. We ought to be with them. We ought to be the hands and feet of Yeshua. What does it say? It says that Yeshua wept. When he saw the friends and family of Lazarus, when they were weeping and crying and mourning, he wept. We're to walk as he walked, right? A big part of that means having empathy, meeting people where they are, being with them, suffering with them. Another answer is that we are to pray. We are to pray for physical and emotional healing. And I don't want to take away from that. I do believe that is part of this new covenant. That is part of this new creation that is ushered in, that is inaugurated by Yeshua's death, resurrection, and his ascension, is that we have the power and the authority to cast out demons. We have the power and the authority to lay our hands on the sick and pray that they would be healed. And I'm not like a Benny Hinn type of guy that says, oh, it'll just, it needs to be filmed on Facebook Live and it's a guarantee. No, but we ought to expect these manifestations within the body of Messiah. That's what Yeshua said. Within the body of Messiah, we ought to expect these manifestations, but it requires an act on our part. It requires us to be the ones to lay the hands. It's through God's people exercising that faith. And lastly, we ought to minister to others with love and compassion. So we eagerly await the time when Yeshua's kingdom will come in its fullness. And it will come in its fullness, and suffering will end. There will be final resolution. But that doesn't mean that we just sit on our hands and do nothing. We are part of God's plan to establish his kingdom on this earth, his rule on this earth, even now. Worship team, if you guys would mind coming up. I'm going to read a passage from Isaiah 58 that I believe drives this last point home here with regard to our mission. This is what Isaiah 58 says, speaking to followers of the God of Israel, that's us. Beginning in verse 6, it says, "Is this not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke?" That's the fast that God chooses for us to have. "Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, 'Here I am.' If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, the speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places, and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt, and shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in." That's our mission, guys. That is the resolution to to the suffering in this world, is us walking that out. If you guys want to pray with me, and actually, can we do this? Would you guys mind putting your hand on the shoulder next to the person next to you? And we're just all going to pray for each other. Okay? If you guys want to pray with me. O Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, Lord. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Father, may your kingdom come. May your kingdom come through us, Lord, to the lost, to the hurting, to those who are suffering. Oh, Father, I just want to lift up a prayer to this community, to all of us, that you strengthen this community, that you strengthen the bond within this community with each other, that you turn us into a different kind of people, God, not a selfish people, not a self-centered, self-interested people, but that we would care about one another. And Father, I pray for everyone here, Lord, that you would bring healing. God, that if there is physical suffering, if there's physical sickness in this auditorium, Lord, I pray, God, that you would supernaturally manifest your presence right now in that moment over that person, over those people, God, that you would take that pain away for your glory, Lord. Father, for the emotional healing, I pray for your comfort. Your word says, Lord, that you are near to the brokenhearted, that you save the crushed in spirit, that you have a special place in your heart for these people that are hurting right now. I pray, God, that you be with them, that you would weep with them right now, that they would be comforted by your love. Father, I pray that you would empower us, not just in this community, but this community would extend out to the four corners of the world, God, that we would lay our hands on the sick and the sick would recover, that we would weep with those that weep, that we would pray for people, that we would meet them where they are, that we would encourage them, that we would be a different kind of people, God, that healing would rise up, as Isaiah 58 says, that this world would be restored, the path would be restored, God. We love you, God. We pray this in your Son, Yeshua's name. Hallelujah.
Shalom, I'm Matthew Vanderels, and I hope you enjoyed this message. Founded in Truth exists to cultivate a fellowship of image bearers that live the redeemed life only Yeshua can give. If this ministry has been a blessing to you, we would love to hear from you. Send us an email through the contact form on our website and tell us how God has used this ministry to edify your faith and relationship with Him. If you'd like to see more messages like this one, subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking here. If you'd like to donate to this ministry and be a part of what God is doing through it, you can donate through our online giving portal here. We thank you for your continued support, and we look forward to next time. Shalom.